Hello, and welcome to Friday's episode of Literary Lutheran Reads the Book of Concord. Today we are beginning Article 6 of the Solid Declaration of the Formula of Concord, which is the third use of God's law. Status of the controversy. God's law is useful, 1, because external discipline and decency are maintained by it against wild, disobedient people. 2, likewise, through the law, people are brought to a knowledge of their sins, and also 3, when people have been born anew by God's Spirit, converted to the Lord, and Moses' veil has been lifted from them, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 13 through 16, they live and walk in the law, Psalm 119, verse 1. A disagreement has arisen between a few theologians about this third and final use of the law. One side taught and maintained that the regenerate do not learn the new obedience in what good works they ought to walk from the law. They argue that this teaching about good works is not to be encouraged from the law. They say the regenerate have been made free by God's Son, have become the temples of His Spirit, and therefore do freely of themselves what God requires of them. They act by the prompting and impulse of the Holy Spirit, just as the sun by itself, without any foreign impulse, completes its ordinary course in the sky. Against this, the other side taught the following. The truly believing are certainly moved by God's Spirit. According to the inner man, they do God's will from a free spirit. Yet the Holy Spirit uses the written law for instruction with them. By this, the truly believing also learn to serve God not according to their own thoughts, but according to His written law and word. This is a sure rule and standard of a godly life and walk. The law shows how to order a life in accordance with God's eternal and unchangeable will. Affirmative statements. For the explanation and final settlement of this disagreement, we unanimously believe, teach, and confess that people who truly believe and are truly converted to God, justified Christians, are liberated and made free from the curse of the law. Galatians chapter 3, verse 10. Yet they should daily exercise themselves in the law of the Lord, as it is written. Blessed is a man whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. Psalm chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. See also Psalm 119, verse 1. The law is a mirror in which God's will and what pleases Him are exactly portrayed. This mirror should be constantly held up to the believers and be diligently encouraged for them without ceasing. The law is not laid down for the just, as the apostle testifies in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9, but for the unrighteous. Yet this is not to be understood in a simplistic way, as though the justified are to live without the law. God's law has been written in their heart, Romans chapter 2, verse 15. Also, a law was given to the first man immediately after his creation, Genesis chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. He was to conduct himself according to this law. What St. Paul means is that the curse of the law cannot burden those who have been reconciled to God through Christ, nor must the law confuse the regenerate with its coercion, for they have pleasure in God's law in the inner man, Romans chapter 7, verse 22. If God's believing and elect children were completely renewed in this life by the indwelling Spirit, so that in their nature and all its powers they were entirely free from sin, they would not need any law. They would need no one to motivate them either. They would do by themselves and completely voluntarily, without any instruction, admonish, urging, or driving of the law what they are in duty bound to do according to God's will. They would act just like the sun, the moon, and all heavenly constellations which have their regular course by themselves. They would act unobstructed, without admonition, urging, driving force, or compulsion, according to God's order, which He once appointed for them. Indeed, they would act just like the holy angels who offer an entirely voluntary obedience. However, believers are not renewed in this life perfectly or completely. Their sin is covered by Christ's perfect obedience, so that it is not charged against believers for condemnation. Also, the putting to death of the old Adam, Romans chapter 6, verse 6, and the renewal in the spirit of their mind, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 23, is begun through the Holy Spirit. Nevertheless, the old Adam still clings to them in their nature and all its inward and outward powers. The apostle has written about this. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. Romans chapter 7, verse 18. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Romans chapter 7, verse 15. But I see in my members another law, waging war against the law of my mind, and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Romans chapter 7, verse 23. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to keep you from doing the things you want to do. Galatians chapter 5, verse 17. This has been the Literary Lutheran Reads the Book of Concord, and I wish you a blessed weekend.